Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. Alexis Okeowo, whose latest book shows how ordinary men and women resist fundamentalism in Africa. Former Beijing bureau chief Richard McGregor, a senior fellow at the Lowy Institute. Russian-born biographer, author and commentator Masha, who now writes from New York. NBC political correspondent Katy, who became a Donald Trump obsession during the 2016 campaign. And Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times critic Wesley. Please welcome our panel. The Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV and live on iView at News Radio, 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. We've got a world of problems to solve tonight, so let's get straight to our first question from Georgina Piggott.
Hi, everyone. The White House Correspondents' dinner just passed with President Donald Trump noticeably absent, but comedian Michelle Wolf blasted the correspondents themselves, saying, he's helped sell your papers and your books and your TV. You helped create this monster, and now you're profiting off him. Should the media accept some responsibility for the election of Donald Trump and everything that's come with it?
Katy, she's talking to you.
No. The media does not deserve the blame if you don't like Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a real thing, and he garnered real support within the country, and he still has a lot of real support within the country that doesn't come from people that might live on the coasts. We did not create him. We covered him because he was a presidential candidate. We covered him because he was starting to attract a lot of attention and because he was gaining support within the country. Would he have existed if we did not put him on television? Yes, there was social media. There's a right-wing radio. I mean, there's right-wing television. He would have existed regardless of whether or not...
Katy, he dominated the news agenda almost effortlessly, going from outrage to outrage in a way that no one's ever done before. And I suppose the question goes to whether the media bought into that, because that's the sort of thing that gives ratings on television, for example.
We were very critical of him as a candidate in the sense that he had no real policy and he was dishonest. He lied a lot. He was very inconsistent. And regardless of whether or not you like him, he was popular. He was elected not because the media put him on television. I know you disagree, and I'm welcoming it. But he was not elected because we put him on TV.
Well, let's hear what Masha has to say.
Well, you can't say that he wasn't elected because we put him on TV. I mean, the media is the public square. This is where the election was played out. And I think the media completely dropped the ball, and we gave him an incredible amount of free coverage. I mean, Donald Trump sailed to the White House on all the free airtime that he got.
There was an exit poll in South Carolina during the primaries that asked people when they decided they wanted to vote for Donald Trump. And it was a month earlier. This was in February. So they decided in January. It was after the Muslim ban. It was after calling John McCain not a war hero. It was after denigrating everybody that came across him. And they liked him because of that. So any amount of coverage that we were giving him, as critical as we were, wasn't going to affect whether or not they were going to vote for him. They had already tuned us out. They decided that they liked him, regardless of whether he was on the cable news.
But Katy, I have heard you say that he got billions of dollars worth of free airtime.
Absolutely. Because
of the way he ran his campaign, as I said earlier, going from outrage to outrage, so you could barely end reporting on the first outrage before you got to the next and the next.
100%.
So you'd had to keep going, reporting outrage after outrage, and no one has ever done this before. It was a new technique, and I guess what Masha is saying is that the media bought into it.
I don't think we bought into it. I think that if you're trying to cover something that's completely new, you're going to cover it in a way that you're probably going to look back and say, I wish I had done this differently here and there. I think if we're talking about how we're going to cover the election in 2020, I would fully support covering more policy and covering more people. I think the problem that we had in our coverage on television and in newspapers during the election was not necessarily how we covered Donald Trump. It was the lack of coverage of the voter and why they were so enamored with him. Not so much this idea that we gave him a free pass to the presidency. That's completely absurd.
Let's
Actually,
go to...
I think the media covered Donald Trump exactly the way that American media have covered elections for at least the last several election cycles, which is horse race kind of coverage, which is not, it's not about policy, it's full of false equivalencies, and it's completely entertainment oriented. The media did not, in fact, cover Donald Trump as a new thing. The media covered him as a normal candidate, which is completely what enabled him.
That's not true. I was on that campaign trail every day, and we did not cover him. I did not cover him as a normal candidate.
Katy, I'm going to come back to you. I just want to hear what the other panelists think. So, Wesley, you start with you.
I mean, look. This is a guy who, I mean, I don't know. The idea of blaming the media is always sort of an interesting problem to me with Donald Trump, because the media created him before he was even running for president. I mean, there's never been a person in any aspect of American politics this fluid or this fluent in the televisual linguistic arts. I mean, that's the only compliment I can pay this man, is that he's good at being on TV. And I don't know, I mean, I'm speaking purely for the way television covered him. I mean, television didn't have a choice, and I'm not even saying like news journalists, I'm saying any other aspect of TV just found him fascinating. And at first, really, I mean, we all know that it was a joke. We thought it was a joke. And then increasingly, it became less funny. But I think TV was sort of set up to think about like conventional politicians operating in a certain mode of behavior, which he never really did, but people kept waiting for that to be a reason for him to either not get any votes or for him to drop out because he wasn't taking it seriously or something. And then there were the people who were watching him because there was a spectacle to watch. I mean, he knew how to be on TV. I don't know. I'm just not really interested in the who's responsible for him question, because I think, I think America is responsible for him in a lot of ways, and I don't think that's really just a media-oriented problem.
We weren't telling anyone how to go vote, period. People voted for who they wanted to vote for.
Katy, you have said there's a lot of soul-searching in newsrooms at top editorial levels, even in your own network, about how you covered him and whether you would do it again, whether you kind of fell into a sort of trap that Donald Trump set because he was so unique.
I think you're right. And again, I think that the wonderful thing about life is that you move forward and you can look back and learn from your mistakes. I think that, again, when we are going back and deciding how to cover 2020, we should be talking to people. We should be covering stories that are important to folks in the communities that they live in. What policies are they worried about? What are they worried about having to do with the economy or with terrorism or with healthcare? I think those are important stories to understand a groundswell for any given candidate. But the idea that we are just going to pick and choose when we pay attention to what now the President of the United States says is I think not right. When the President of the United States makes news, when he says something outrageous, when he tweets policy, deciding to take all transgenders out of the military, we have to cover that. It is outrageous, yes, to many. People say ignore his Twitter. You cannot ignore the President of the United States' Twitter, especially when the White House has said those are official statements. And when it's abundantly clear that there is no policy in place at the White House. They're just playing catch up to whatever he says. So do we cover him flawlessly? Absolutely not. But it's a process, and I just don't think that we are responsible for Donald Trump being elected because you don't like Donald Trump.
Let's go across to Alexis, and you sort of, I guess you've watched this a little bit with some distance because you spent a lot of time recently in Africa. But coming back to the States as you did, how does it feel seeing and watching that man become president?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting discussion because, I agree with Wesley. I don't necessarily think it's productive or right to say that the medium is to blame, but I wonder about sort of contrasting and comparing the coverage of Trump with the coverage of Hillary Clinton. You know, I think I've been reading more that there's now, you know, reflection from journalists who covered Hillary and who wondered if they spent too much time focusing on her emails, focusing on the sort of the blasts from Trump, which, you know, were inevitably quite petty about Hillary that the media tended to seize upon.
They did have the FBI chief saying right before the election, hang on, we're going to investigate these even further now. Right. But I wonder, you know, if there is something worth learning from that. And I think the problem is the fact that Trump was a spectacle and the media had to cover him, but it inevitably detracted and I think complicated the coverage of his opponents. I think that often to the disadvantage of viewers, of voters who I think got an overabundance of a certain type of coverage of one candidate as opposed to the others. Richard, you spent a lot of time in Washington as a correspondent, but you never saw anything quite like this.
No, but I contest this notion of the media as the public square. That you could not have had more negative coverage of Trump. Journalists could not have uncovered more wrongdoing by him, more atrocities by him, slanders by him against various people. But you know, there's about 50 public squares. Some people were listening to one message here, another set of people listening to one message there. So there's no sort of, you know, aggregation of public opinion like there used to be. I think also Katy's point as well, that the media has no choice but to cover him in that respect. You know, the good, the bad, the ugly, and some people just were not listening to the ugly at all.
Move on to our next question. It's on the same subject, so we'll get plenty of chance to talk about Donald Trump. It's from Callum Lawrence. Different perspective.
Hi. What would you say to the suggestion that... what would you say to the suggestion that a lot of people worldwide are jumping on the bandwagon, per se, in opposing Trump? Because mainstream media is focusing more on gossip and gossip and that sort of thing, instead of focusing more on his policies and his political successes and failures.
Wesley.
Oh no, I want to hear Masha answer. I
want to hear you first, Wesley.
Well, first of all, to the degree that the media has a role in covering this man, I feel like one of the things that has been astounding to me is how trying to figure out what to do with all the things that we had never seen before just confused everybody. I mean, this is a man who has he's got a long business history that, like, theoretically was vetted, but not in the context of running for the presidency. So we're still figuring that out, and there seems to be a lot of bottom there. I think the things that when we cover Donald Trump, I mean, there isn't a lot of policy to cover, for one thing.
Well, you've got company tax cuts. You've got
you're not gonna get all your fingers here. Yeah. So I mean, we're talking about like executive orders. I mean, from a policy standpoint, there's a lot of things to cover, but you're still. It feels like you still have to cover him on defense because of whatever norms that the term norms is one that comes up a lot with Trump, obviously, because he flouts them. But there is a kind of fight for American democratic civilization that we seem to be up against with him, and that has nothing to do with any particular policy. It's like, I think America is sort of fighting for the salvation of itself in a lot of ways, and that's separate from the normal sort of policy fights we used to have the luxury of having.
Masha, I mean, our questioner talks about successes, and Trump would argue that the economy is doing very well, that he has actually got through a big range of tax cuts that, we'll talk about.
Well, the tax cuts haven't taken effect yet, so. No. And at this point, he has nothing to take credit for in how the economy is doing. But I think, you know, even with the economy, actually, it's our job to cover not just what he's doing, but what he is doing to us. I mean, that's what the media do. The media have to reflect reality as it changes. And so it's, you know, if anything, I think we're not doing enough of that. We're not focusing enough on, you know, the effects of deregulation. We're not focusing enough on the effects of of degradation, actually, that his rhetoric and his language and his behavior are causing in society and to our language and to our behavior and to our perceptions.
Can you have a serious debate about all of those things and simultaneously follow the Trump scandals, the Russia collusion arguments, all of that sort of stuff, which is an obsession of many newspapers, quite rightly. But is it possible that slipping off the agenda is climate change and many other policy issues?
Absolutely. We're incapable of following all of it at the same time. There is too much of it, and that's one of the things that Trump is doing to us. And that in itself deserves to be described as a phenomenon.
Katy, what do you think?
Well, I think you're right about that. And it's an imperfect metaphor, so forgive me, but I describe Donald Trump thusly. He's a man who got a stain on his shirt. He was eating a hot dog and he got mustard on his shirt. And instead of changing his shirt or trying to get the stain out, he's now taken the relish and the ketchup and the onions, and he's just staining the shirt up entirely to the point where you don't know where the original stain was, and oh, that's just the way the shirt is supposed to look. And when you talk about normalization in America, normalizing this president, it's a hard thing to define. Is normalizing covering a piece of policy as just a piece of policy? Is normalizing letting go of maybe the personal attack on Mika Brzezinski and not covering that as much because it's not as important as maybe what's happening in the environment? He's made it very confusing, and I don't want to be the person defending mainstream media or TV news, because I do think that we can do better. It's just unclear how exactly we accomplish that and get people to pay attention. The newspapers are covering the rollback of regulations. The newspapers are doing a good job covering what might happen, say, if the Iran deal gets torn up. The TV stations are trying to keep up with it as well, but when you're in this 24-hour news cycle, oftentimes there's a new piece of news about a cabinet member, spending millions of dollars in taxpayers' money. It's just hard to keep up with how much is happening in America right now.
Alexis, do you feel like you can keep up?
Yeah, I think it's difficult, but I agree with Masha about the need to cover the way this is affecting people. I mean, what's happening in America is not the only case of, having someone in government who is focused on sort of personal corrupt rule. And America is going through basically several humanitarian disasters, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about ICE, we're talking about mass deportations, we're talking about I feel like these are issues that need to be covered at a more intimate level, to not just show the cycle of sort of the constant policy shifts, but also the way it is affecting Americans, the way it's completely turning our society upside down. That's what I'd like to see more of.
I'm going to move... sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, the big thing about Trump, there's the degradation of office, but it's happening at warp speed. That is gripping. The economy, by the way, is just ticking over. It's not doing anything special. None of the issues he focused on, wages, blue-collar jobs, none of that has changed at all. And in fact, there's a ton of policy stuff going on, mainly unravelling policy, which he just disagrees with. And that is three separate, lots of different things happening, and it's hard to knit that together in any coherent whole, particularly when he's throwing something, another thing on the Barbie every 5 minutes sort of thing.
That's how he operated during the campaign.
The most insidious thing that he's doing, and he's done to our country, is our inability to talk to each other. Especially when you get on social media. If you say one thing that someone decides they don't agree with you on, or you say, the economy is doing okay, and or there was an uptick for this certain month, people will jump on top of you and try to tear you apart for saying something friendly towards the president. On the other side, if you say something negative, they will jump on you from the other side and try to tear you apart. They're screaming at each other across social media, and that's playing out at dinner tables. It's becoming increasingly hard for people to have a civil conversation about things they disagree with.
Let's move on to something that Trump does claim credit for. The question's from John Lozano.
Hi. In recent years, we've seen politics become more extreme and polarised, as you just said, and we've seen political discourse dumbed down and messages simplified. Free word slogans are now the norm, and they have no substance. And when you break them down, if any solutions are offered, they're illogical. Yet this week, we have seen an approach stemming from name-calling and taunting seemingly achieve some traction in North Korea.
Yeah, Richard, we'll start with you since your sort of special area of expertise, but is it actually the case that Trump's threats have effectively led to a potential peace deal?
Well, look, an American president is always powerful in Asia. Trump has no doubt had some influence in where we've got so far, but just remember, nothing has really happened yet. You know, the two Koreas have met previously, 92, 95, 2012, 2008. We're not about to get unification. That's not even on the agenda. We're going to perhaps have a peace treaty and greater contact between the Koreas. All that is a good thing. How much is Trump responsible for that? Maybe a little bit. It's very hard to tell. I mean, one of his potentially great qualities is his ability to keep the other side off balance. He can sort of, destabilise China a little bit to make them talk to him, give up a little bit. Possibly that's true. But I don't think the Chinese would have really put pressure on North Korea unless they thought it was in their own interest to do so. So the trouble with Trump, he may have done some good, but of course it's not all about Trump. It's about China, and quintessentially in this case, it's an intra-Korean thing. So, too early for the Nobel Prize, I think, Tony, for Mr. Trump yet.
Yeah, Masha, what do you think? Because this is a pretty extraordinary moment in many respects, and he is claiming complete success and he's attributing it to himself.
Oh, well, if Trump is claiming complete success, then, let's give him the Nobel Prize. I mean, come on. He has tweeted insults and we're supposed to think that that has made an actual policy difference in the world? How idiotic is that conversation? Why are we having it?
Yeah.
Katy.
I will be the idiot of the bunch, I guess. Listen, I'm not an expert in Asia policy. I can't tell you, I can't speak with authority on this. I can speak with authority on the way Donald Trump operates, and I think it's a little ridiculous to ascribe a madman strategy to him. I don't think that he intended to keep people off balance, and that's his big negotiating tactic. I can't say definitively, though, that whatever he's done by tweeting about big buttons and calling him Little Rocket Man, maybe that worked. I don't know. I think it's way too early to tell. And I would caution that even in the best of circumstances, you had, Arafat and Rabin on the White House lawn in 1993 shaking hands for a historic peace agreement between the Palestinians and Israel. And look what happened after that. There was another intifada. I mean,
They did, however, get Nobel Peace Prizes.
They did.
That's what Trump supporters were chanting at this point.
It's way
too
early to tell, and it doesn't matter ultimately because Donald Trump will claim credit, and by the time something significant happens, he could be out of office, and it doesn't matter. He operates on a moment-to-moment basis. He's not looking a week ahead. He's not looking a year ahead. He's operating in how can I look best right now? And right now, I'm going to take credit for having talks with North Korea.
So, Wesley, do you take any pride at all in the fact that your president is claiming that he caused a great breakthrough in one of the most intractable problems in the world?
No, because I'm sane. I mean, listen, everything I know about this has come from reading other journalists write about it or cover it on the news. But I do not trust any aspect of this man with a nuclear peace deal at all. And I think that North Korea and South Korea are talking. Something good has happened, but it only takes one Donald Trump move I'm hoping it's more stable than Donald Trump doing one thing to destabilize it. But of course he's going to take credit for it. He takes credit for everything that's good that remotely comes in the vicinity of his leadership.
That didn't even happen.
But he's like any politician in that respect, right? I mean, that's not unusual.
No, not exactly.
Well, maybe, but it's extra offensive to me and worrying, I guess, to think about the idea that, the other factor in this conversation is Kim Jong-un, and the two of them have some kind of bad, good chemistry that, you know, the madman theory is interesting. I'm now thinking out loud about this. Like, they're just two crazy people. They're just two crazy people, and like I'm surprised and impressed and relieved in some ways that we've left the trying to out crazy each other stage of these developments, but there's still time to go back.
And Tony, one thing I forgot to mention: Kim Jong-un has given up nothing.
Yeah,
He's
that's
got his
the other
bomb
thing.
and he's got his missile capability, and he hasn't even met Mr. Trump.
We did
yet.
say he'd stop testing, I think.
Well, he stopped testing missiles to go to America. He can still drop a missile on South Korea and Japan.
Sure.
And he's already proven that allegedly has the capability to do that.
And Dini, you know, so we're just at the start of a process.
What could be more problematic is not necessarily what happens with North Korea, say nothing happens. More problematic could be our relationships with our allies. And what happens with Japan if Japan sees us as going to negotiate with North Korea and leaving them out of it. Not caring about the fact that they can still be hit by a missile and only negotiating for intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the U.S.
Well, Japan's already mad. I mean, they're already at that point where
Absolutely.
they feel left out of these conversations.
Richard earlier mentioned China. We've got a question on that subject. I'll throw it just to him, but it's from Eugene Kui.
Following on from this discussion, North Korea intends to implement, as Andrei Lankov characterises it, a Chinese-style economic program. For this, China's 1978 Reform and Opening program ignited an unprecedented economic boom that sees China today as the world's second largest economy and a key global power. How do you think this program will play out in North Korea? And given the context of these tensions with North Korea, what will this mean for the world?
Yeah, Richard.
First thing, China will love that. Let me illustrate this with a story. When I moved back to Shanghai in 2000, one day half the city was closed down because the Chinese were bringing in Kim Jong-il to give him a tour of the GM plant to show him Chinese workers making Buicks, which of course are still popular in China, even though they're not so popular in the States anymore. So China has wanted North Korea for years. They've sort of said, look, you can be a dictator, you can be an authoritarian government like us, and you can still get rich. But the North Koreans, Kim Jong-il thought the Chinese were sort of capitalist roaders and that sort of thing, and traitors to socialism. So they really want North Korea to develop. It's great for the Chinese provinces alongside North Korea, which are going backwards. It's great for South Korea, because South Korea can't afford unification. It would cost them too much money. So if Kim Jong-un actually does that, then that would be, over time, absolutely transformative, because, Asia is full of economic miracles, except in one country, North Korea, which is a command economy. Now, it's got half the population of South Korea, and its economy is about 1/3 the size.
And Richard, just a brief follow-up. Does that suggest to you that China may have played a far bigger role behind the scenes in what we now see happening than, for example, Trump?
Well, China definitely turned the screws on North Korea. They cut off oil. They've been instrumental in bringing them to the negotiating table. We should never forget that Chinese and North Koreans don't like each other, very mistrustful. And the Chinese especially have no respect for a 34-year-old leader of a country. I think they believe in age and experience and all that sort of thing. So they've been very angry at Kim Jong-un, and they've started to get him back where they want him now. I think nothing would happen without China.
Okay, we'll go back to the United States again. We've got a question from Justine Landis-Hanley.
Thank you. There has been talk that Kanye, Mark Zuckerberg or Oprah should run for the presidency in 2020. Is there truth to the idea that the American people are drawn to celebrity personalities in politics, like Trump or Reagan, or do these choices represent something bigger that the public want in their leadership?
Alexis, let me bring you in here. What do you think about that? Oprah for president, Kanye West for president?
Lord.
I think
not Kanye, hopefully. But
probably not Mark Zuckerberg either, since the Facebook scandal.
There is a cult of celebrity in the U.S. There has been for a long time. I think that it's part of what people found appealing about Trump. I think it's probably a quality that would be appealing, for any future candidates in the next election. I think that Americans aren't necessarily unique with this respect, but do I think that this would be, something to aspire to in the next election? No. I think there was a time early in the year when people were wondering or sort of saying if Oprah should run. And I kind of thought, if there was someone who was going to run against Trump, it would be, I think, useful for someone to have that kind of mass popular appeal to voters, someone who's a household name and sort of who could compete against the spectacle that is Trump. But, sort of on further thought, I think that we have to make sure it is someone of substance, which has been...
Let's go just hear from Wesley on this. Sure, sort of the cultural commentator here. And is it possible, do you think, the Democrats could be attracted by the fool's gold of celebrity when it comes to picking a candidate to go up against Trump, who possibly could be in line for a second term?
I mean, I can't speak to what the Democrats want or should do in this respect. I just think are we not learning a lesson right now? I mean, I do think that there is really something, we've learned the lesson, haven't we? I mean, maybe we haven't. I don't know. We'll see what happens when 2020 rolls around.
But the lesson might be this is how you win power in modern America.
But I think that this is, I don't know. I mean, I would defer to people whose sense of history is a lot, is broader than mine. But it would seem that this is a really unique situation that we have here in Donald Trump. And I think the place from which this comes is uniquely American. But I also think that, I think Oprah should stay home. I think Oprah is already presidential. She does not need to run for this office to get this job. And I think that, as Americans, I think we do believe in this office enough to not want it vilified or degraded in the way that it is currently being degraded. I don't know what that looks like, in an election 2 years from now. But I do believe, and this is the part where I talk about the Muller investigation a little bit. I think if it is allowed to continue, I honestly believe that the finished document will be some type of holy writ that we will use to patch up a messed up system that we haven't really closely examined in a long time. And I think it'll be some sort of biblical text by which America can look at itself and a horrible thing that happened. And part of one of the lessons I think we could learn from its outcome is that, there is a degree to which a kind of experience matters. I think there are a lot of things about Washington and American government that should change. I don't think the solution to those problems is a sort of questionable real estate developer who had a hit TV show. Just think about that. And I still think about that this is the person who is running the country. That has not gotten old to me.
Yep, Katy, quite a lot to pick up on there. One would be whether you might sort of see yourself going from beginning to end in a campaign following Oprah, another celebrity in the next election. The other one, of course, is what Wesley said there about the holy writ of the Muller investigation when it comes down. A lot of people are hoping it'll lead to an indictment.
I'll take the first part of that question first. I don't know what the Democrats are going to decide or who they're going to decide to put up. And I don't know who the I hate Donald Trump Republicans are going to decide to put up to try and primary him. And I don't know what will work, if that is going toe-to-toe with him in terms of getting down in the mud, or if that's taking the high road. I will point you to what happened in a special election in Pennsylvania last month between the Republican Rick Saccone, who was running on I was Trump before Donald Trump was Trump, and calling everybody who didn't support him not believers in God or God-hating. And then there was a gentleman named Connor Lamb running on the Democratic ticket who was running a very clean, a very boring campaign, all about policy and representing that district and not tying himself to the National Democratic Party, and he won. So is the solution for Democrats to pick somebody who's the antithesis of Donald Trump, scandal-free, somebody who's not going to make headlines constantly because it's exhausting people, or is it to find somebody who's willing to, fight him in the bleachers like Joe Biden? As for the Mueller investigation, I as an American, as a citizen, I'm fascinated to know what he finds. I'm not so sure that he's going to find the smoking gun of coordination or collusion. Then again, I wouldn't be surprised if he did. The question is not what he finds, but how damning does it need to be to convince 5-10% of the hard rock 30% of Americans who believe in Donald Trump and who think the Mueller investigation is a bunch of BS, that it's real and that it matters. And until we get to a point where we can chip off that certain, I'm going to believe in you no matter what happens, we're going to be in a rough situation. I just don't know. I don't know how it ends.
Masha, you obviously don't know how it ends. But what do you think? I mean, it started off talking about the nature of celebrity politics, Trump being the ultimate example of that, an extraordinary one, and whether that could be played out in the next election again. But we've moved on to Mueller, obviously.
I'm worried, actually, that that's the tack that Democrats will choose, because I don't think you can out-Trump Trump, and I think it's a mistake to try. I think that, and I think, yes, Trump is a uniquely American phenomenon, but we do have something to learn from history. And history is full of these populist leaders who appeal to an imaginary past. And the thing to do is not to tell the public that they're bad and not to argue with them about the imaginary past. The thing to do is to offer a vision of a future. And that's something that Democratic politicians haven't been doing. Oprah is not the answer to that. Policy is actually an answer to that. Imaginative thinking is an answer to that. Imaginative political thinking is an answer to that. And that's what I really want to see. Now, as for the Mueller investigation, I actually agree with Katy. I think that the likelihood of a smoking gun is extremely low. I think that there's a lot of magical thinking going on about around the Mueller investigation. I think that a lot of people hope that the moment that Mueller comes back with his conclusions, our national nightmare will be over. Somehow, magically, we will discover that the Russians elected Trump and Americans didn't, and it will all go away. And we're still going to be left with Americans having elected Trump.
How different would it be if there is a massive swing to the Democrats in the midterm elections and they take Congress and the Senate, and you have a completely different political setup for him to face when it comes to a potential indictment?
Oh, you know what? I'll be so happy if that happens. Yeah. And I so don't believe that that's going to happen. Let's just wait and see.
Richard, what do you think?
Well, I think it's very unlikely to get the Senate, but let's say they get the House, and there'll be a big push then for Democrats to try to impeach Trump. And I think that'll be a massive error, because if you want to beat Trump, you should beat him at the ballot box, not through sort of forcing him out of office by other means. As to what comes next, I think the best description I heard about the Trump presidency when I was in DC, a friend of mine said, I'm exhausted by 8 a.m. in the morning, because the tweets come in and your head is spinning and everything like that. So I think the electorate will be exhausted as well, and the electorate will be looking for something different. And I think if you want to beat Trump, you should beat Trump or Trumpism at the ballot box. But having said that, I think he's changed politics, the sorts of things the media missed, the anger in the electorate, all that'll be factored in the next time.
Well, the Democrats will certainly be looking at the Mueller results of his investigation, let's say, to see whether impeachment is a possibility.
Yeah, they will, and I think that would be a big mistake. But the Democrats, of course, agree with Trump on lots of things, on trade and things like that. So they might be running on what we think are Trumpian policies. They agree with him. So I think he's changed the nature of politics or policy in any case, even if he's there or not.
Can I just say,
yeah, sure.
I just want to make clear my belief in this investigation. I actually don't care I don't think it's going to solve all kinds of things that are wrong. I do think that it will be like a large canvas story that tells something about what happened in this country. I don't know that it necessarily has to be pointing to specific things that would bring down a presidency. But I think any curious American, any American who believes in his or her country, should want this investigation to be completed just to see where it goes. And it doesn't necessarily have to result in his impeachment. That's not what I want necessarily to happen. But I am curious about the story that it's going to tell about this country and what happened.
We'll move on. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep your eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Nipun Agawa.
Hi, I wanted to find out, is Putin already waging a Cold War through cyberspace and espionage, and how these strategies changing the world? For example, the influence on the US election.
Masha, Gessen, you sort of alluded a little bit to where the investigation might go, but the question is asking whether Putin is basically waging a cyber war and whether the US election was a core battleground.
I very much doubt that the goal of Russian interference, well, actually, I don't very much doubt. I don't think that the goal of Russian interference was to get Trump elected. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that Putin doesn't actually believe that there is such a thing as an election that doesn't have a preordained result. Right? So they were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to get elected. But they very much wanted to mess with the United States, and they very much wanted to undermine faith in the electoral system. And I think to a great extent it worked, and it keeps working. And that's something that Putin is doing not just in the United States, but actually all over the Western world. It's not the only kind of war he's waging. He also believes that he is involved in a hot war with the United States in Ukraine and in Syria. And I think it's really important to understand that that's how he views those conflicts. Let's stick with the cyber war for a moment. I mean, do you agree with the assessment of US intelligence that Putin himself directed a campaign to interfere, whether he wanted to elect Trump or not, to seriously mess with, interfere with the US electoral system? Well, it would be a little silly for me to agree or disagree with the assessment of 17 intelligence agencies. You know, they are working with classified information that I haven't seen. The declassified intelligence report was frankly ridiculous. It was it was not 17 pages, it was a number of pages about RT and basically its journalistic practices, which to a large extent are standard journalistic practices. And the idea that those could have influenced American public opinion is absurd. But actually, more interestingly, the working theory of the intelligence report is that Russians influenced the American election outcome by influencing American public opinion, which gets us right back to the place where Americans elected Trump. Right? Well, they did obviously influence public opinion through the Internet Research Agency's work on Facebook and in social media, and you've seen the indictments by the Muller investigation, which certainly focus on a series of people working in St. Petersburg to do precisely that. I mean, you're not denying that that happened. Well, no, we're not denying that that happened. I'm denying that we can establish a causal relationship. So no causal relationship between, for example, the hacking of the DNC emails, evidently by Russian intelligence agencies, and then the release during the campaign of enormously embarrassing emails to Oh, no, there's definitely a causal relationship with that. I'm saying that there's
a multifaceted thing, that's what I'm saying.
Absolutely, but what I'm saying is that we haven't established a causal relationship between that and the outcome of the election. That said, the election was decided by 77,000 votes in 3 counties. Anything it could have swung the outcome of the election. Katy, what do you think? We're getting a lot more information about this, obviously, with the Muller investigation and others, and it's obviously a huge focus of that investigation, where there's actually collusion between Trump and the Russians over the release of the emails, for example. But what do you think about the nature of the interference?
I cannot tell you definitively who it swayed and how it swayed them. I can tell you from what I saw when I was there as it happened. When the first batch of Hillary Clinton emails started being released, Donald Trump seized on it, and he would take a batch of WikiLeaks and he would wave it to the crowd. I love WikiLeaks, he would say over and over again. There was a point, and he used it to really establish what many voters already believed, which was that Hillary Clinton can't be trusted, that she's corrupt, that she's out for herself and not out for anybody else, and no one likes her. There was a point in...
And he literally called for the Russians to hack
He did. That was at a press conference, and I pressed him on that. I said, are you sure you would like a foreign government to hack into the email of a private citizen or a politician in this country? Does it not give you pause? No, it gives me no pause. We need to see those emails. He said it to the world. In October, after the Access Hollywood tape came out, the campaign hit for that campaign, rock bottom. People went dark. Kellyanne Conway suddenly was not on television.
Thank God. That was a great moment for America.
Chris Christie, who had been, stalking Trump Tower, was suddenly disappearing. Reince Priebus did a double take on whether or not he should go into Trump Tower when he was commuting in at Grand Central. And
then comes
Donald
the next
Trump,
batch of emails.
And Donald Trump is furious. And what happens? The emails come out. And then it doesn't make it better for him. It's still bad. He's still being hit from all sides. He now has women coming out and accusing him of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct and groping them or forcing himself on them. He denies it, but they keep coming. And then suddenly, what was potentially more consequential than the WikiLeaks is James Comey reopening the email investigation and having to announce it. That breathed new life into the Trump campaign.
I think you actually, in your book, you said that's the moment when you heard that you knew that Trump was going to win.
I knew it. I mean, what Donald Trump needed to convince moderate Republicans and independents who were on the fence about him was a justification for them to cast a vote for him. And the justification was, you can't vote for somebody who might be under federal investigation. We didn't know at the time that Donald Trump was under federal investigation because Comey and the FBI decided not to tell us about that. But he needed it, and it gave him and his voters the reason they needed to tell their friends why they voted for Donald Trump and to justify it to themselves, despite the fact that he bragged about grabbing women by the genitals.
But I also think like a fundamental question too is the agency of the American people, right? Because this narrative has often spun off in two ways. One is that, people are just sort of too dumb or too gullible, that they believe the fake news, that they were completely swayed by the emails, and that this was inevitable. This happened to them. The vote, in a way, happened to the American people. That, as opposed to people voted for Trump because of certain reasons, whether we're talking about economic, xenophobia, any variety of things. And so I think it's tricky when we're talking about Russian interference and we're talking about the concrete things they did, but also how the American people reacted. Are we saying that because of this interference that there was no choice, it was inevitable, they had to be swayed by this? Or are we saying that there's something deeper there and that people who lived in certain places are, really all over the country, and wider than we thought and making more money than we previously thought, and from demographics we didn't expect, voted for this man? And I still don't know if there's like a deep exploration of why that happened, beyond reasons of interference, beyond reasons of emails. What is there that will help us learn more about what may come next for the next election?
Yeah, Richard.
Well, I kind of think, I agree with that. 70,000 voters in 3 states, a lot of things could have swayed that. It's not only about people who voted, it's about people who stayed home. That was a big part of it in Michigan and Pennsylvania and the like. But something bigger happened than just that. It's something bigger in America, and I think that's the main issue, about general discontent, about so many angry people, and Trump's ability to unearth that and weaponize it. That's a bigger issue, I think, than interference is very important, but we're never going to know whether that, as you say, whether there's a real causal link, and I think that's not the main issue.
OK, let's move on. The next question is from Mahalia McDaniel.
Hi, everyone. As an Australian African-American, I was particularly moved by the recent opening of the Legacy Museum and Memorial in Alabama, which highlights America's troubling past of slavery and lynching. So my question for the panel is, can the scars from the past ever fully heal? And what can Australians learn from this museum when it comes to telling the history of Indigenous Australians?
Alexis, I'll start with you because you've written quite movingly about this museum in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yeah,
I mean, memorial, I suspect.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, this group in Alabama, the Equal Justice Initiative, did an interesting thing, which is forcing Alabama and America as a whole to reckon with a part of its past that's often been buried. I mean, especially the Deep South, especially Alabama, is a place that loves to, you know, talk about its history, is obsessed with its history, but only certain parts of it. You know, obsessed with the Confederacy, obsessed with the myths about what the past once was, allegedly, a sort of a glorified past. And I think that's like a countrywide obsession. And so I think, you know, it's so potent here in Australia, too. I think that there are a lot of parts of the history here dealing with First Peoples, dealing with Indigenous populations that haven't been reckoned with. And I think that even with this memorial, it's just a first step, right? Because it's just, it's a way to make physical a part of history that's often not discussed.
It's also unimaginable, that history, for many people, though we know it's true.
Right.
So when I read your article, I was shocked at some of the things, well, I mean, you should be shocked anyway, but some of the things that people were lynched for.
Right.
And we're talking not only about men, but sometimes their entire families.
Right. I mean, and I think that, you know, one thing you can see in the myriad of reasons for why Black men and women were lynched, you know, it was often at its core a preoccupation with Black guilt and Black dangerousness. And that's something that obviously we can still see today, where there have been many recent cases of just being Black being considered a crime. That necessitates a call to the police or security. And so I think it's an interesting step as far as to see if it adds to the national conversation, if we do attempt to reckon more with racial terror. So, you know, I'm optimistic.
Wesley, let me bring you in here. Do we even know how many people were lynched in, I guess, the period covering nearly a century?
Well, I mean, the museum is 4,400
about 4,400.
So.
Although that's not everyone.
Right. I mean, I was going to say that's just the ones we know about.
Yeah.
And I mean, but the question is really, I mean, the question being asked to us is also about Indigenous peoples in some way. And I mean, of all the things that America doesn't want to deal with,
right.
I mean, slavery and, you know, American Indians are two things that just, you know, well, I guess we did that. We moved on. We're done. And that isn't true. There is a sort of refusal to acknowledge. I mean, the entire sort of moral affront of a Trump candidacy and what it as a tagline stood for was exactly the opposite of what this museum is meant to acknowledge having happened in the first place. I mean, this is to say nothing about American Indians and the way they are not part of any conversation that happens in this country about affronted peoples. But it is fascinating to me that in the last 18 months, there has been a real push from Native peoples to hold on to the land that is theirs. And you see these confrontations at places like Standing Rock that are about keeping land that is rightfully theirs, and you know, not having it trespassed by capitalist interests, basically. But these aren't conversations that America is entirely comfortable having.
Wesley, that's the point I wanted to come to with you. I mean, how do you think white America could come to terms with its own, horrific legacy? Because I saw you talking after Charlottesville, where you saw on TV white Americans.
Know what my answer is going to be.
White Americans.
There's only one answer.
White Americans fighting white Americans over racial issues in Charlottesville, and you said it's time for us black people to take a vacation and let them fight it out.
That's the answer. I didn't make anybody racist, and the solution to racism isn't telling me that a white person is racist. It's white people talking to each other about the reality of not only a history that affects non-white people, but a history that was begun and propagated by white people against non-white people. And so I can sit here, I mean, the whole frustration for me about having these national conversations about race in the US has a lot to do with the fact that typically when they happen, it's black people giving lectures to white people about how to be better white people. And I'm lectured out. Like, I think it's a lecture that white people have to like, give to each other. And, you know, until President Trump goes on national television and says, you know, those people who went to Charlottesville and held those tiki torches and went on that march, those are horrible people and they don't represent anything that I believe in as an American, which... I don't think it's possible to have these. I mean, Barack Obama repeatedly felt a moral duty, eventually more comfortably felt a moral duty to address the deaths at the hands of the police and other sort of para-law enforcement entities, and got in a lot of trouble or felt heat from people who felt he was talking to black people at the expense of talking to white people. That was indicative to me that we aren't ready to have this conversation, and it would be interesting to have a white president who felt comfortable enough to address these things in a sort of serious, incredible, and earnest way.
Katy, that's not likely to be Donald Trump, obviously. So, but 8 years of Barack Obama didn't come close to solving these deep-seated problems. What do you think?
I don't think 8 years could ever be enough time to solve hundreds of years of history. I'm not sure what the answer is. I think if you look at the arc of history, we've been moving in a more tolerant direction, most certainly. I think that we fall back in times when we've lurched forward. So if you're taking just minorities as a whole, we had right before Donald Trump announced he was running for president, or right after, before he became a serious candidate, the vote for marriage equality in America, and the Supreme Court deciding that that was constitutional. It was a real moment of the country lurching forward and becoming more progressive. I think Donald Trump is a reaction to that as much as he's a reaction to the first black president. I'm very curious to see what the reaction to Donald Trump looks like.
Now, I was here from Masha on this. I mean, you're living in the States now, and of course you carry with you this terrible burden of what's happening in Russia, but what do you think about these issues in the States?
Well, I've spent many years writing about memory and reckoning in Russia, which doesn't have a great track record, and I'm afraid I'm really not very hopeful about countries dealing with their past unless they're forced to. Usually, you see countries dealing with their past when there is a military defeat, or when there is a real population shift that necessitates a reckoning. The United States might be on the verge of that kind of population shift, and I think that is part of the panic.
What does that look like to you? You mean a sort of demographic population shift?
Well, the white people becoming the minority in the country, and I mean, when I was talking to voters, one of the things I would hear often is, I think we should go back to what a presidency looked like in the 1950s, or what America looked like in the 1950s. And I would say, well, you know, there was segregation and lots of really troublesome stuff. Oh, but I don't mean that stuff. I just mean, you know, the other stuff. But it's code for, I want white people to run the country. I want white people to be in charge. I want white people to be the ones deciding, you know, what happens in schools, and you know, what happens with health care, and how we have conversations. It's a discomfort among some voters with not recognizing not only their country, but their government.
But we've got time for one last question. It's from Atufa Mahana.
Do you think online platforms such as Twitter are genuinely revolutionizing our approach to serious issues, or simply reducing their importance and minimizing them and desensitizing us to their gravity?
Alexis, I'll start with you. you work in long form writing, and that's kind of inspiring to some of these kids, I have to tell you, because I've seen some of their other questions, but they're asking about whether social media is dumbing down the discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. I think in some ways it may be, but I think it's also widening it in a way. I think that, you know, it's unfortunate because I think that in a lot of ways, when we're dealing with something like the Trump presidency, which is so extreme, and we're talking about the way it affects Americans, what we need more than ever is sort of deeper, considered reporting, going to places, talking to people, finding out what's going on, and trying to figure out many sides to places. You know, one thing that I found kind of unfortunate during the election was that often places like the Deep South were kind of flattened in a way. It was decided that this is a red state region, and that people here are the certain kind of voters. There's like the stereotype of the white working class voter that sort of eliminated all the complexity and diversity that are in places like this. You know, we didn't really talk about the black working class. We didn't talk about small towns that are now majority Latino, and that have their own, that's already has sort of happening, what Masha mentioned, where places are already becoming minority white and are reckoning with that, and progress is coming about by force. And so I think that, you know, that's what I'm an advocate of, is that sort of longer, deeper reporting. But at the same time, I do recognize that social media, Twitter, is, for better or worse, bringing people together who might not be in conversation. Whether that's fruitful conversation, I don't know, but I think it's still useful in some aspects.
Richard, what do you think? Speak for the old-fashioned journalist in you.
I love Twitter, but if you ever want to get any serious work done, stay off it. If you go on Twitter, there's always something interesting to read. You discover lots of your long-form pieces there and print them out, you know. But it's speeding things. To give a Twitter-length answer, it's speeding things up. It's not adding to the gravity or ballast of the debate. It's just another tool, but you've got to try and stay off it if you really want to think, because it doesn't help you think.
Marsha, let me bring this to you, but with an example, because I know you've written about Michelle Wolf's monologue at the White House Correspondents' dinner, and most people will only learn little tiny snippets of it through Twitter. Most people won't sit down and watch the entire speech.
The entire 15 minutes.
Yeah. I know, it's phenomenal, isn't it? But that's true.
Yeah.
And but you actually regard this as the most significant monologue since Trump came to power. Tell us why.
Well, I regard it as the most significant comedic monologue since Trump came to power. No, I think that we've had this interesting sort of phenomenon of laughter as a reality check since Trump came to power, and I have found it very disturbing because the way that laughter and comedy has functioned is very familiar to me from living in a totalitarian society. It's like it's this anti-totalitarian laughter, but usually in a totalitarian society it exists because the jokes are the only place where you can sort of grab hold of reality, because the media are controlled by the state and you don't have a public sphere and you don't have reality reflected there. So my question was really, what is it about sort of late night comedians that reflects reality and that grabs it back from, you know, the New York Times and from CNN? And I think that Michelle Wolf really brought it forward. She performed this humor in a more edgy way than it is done in late night, in front of the people who have this.
Trump accepted.
Trump accepted, but no, but I'm not even talking about Trump. I'm talking about people who are engaged in these fictions of civility and performance, right? And the fictions are that Trump can perform the presidency, and we, the journalists, can perform civility, and that we can even come together and be nice to each other and be civil to each other. And that the dignity of the office is maintained, and the dignity of the news is maintained, when actually, manifestly, none of it is maintained, right? But it's only manifest late night in the comic shows, and she just blasted all those fictions to hell, which I think is why the reaction to her monologues is so extreme, because if you look at people, you know, complaining that she insulted Sarah Huckabee Sanders' looks. It's actually not in the monologue. She didn't. people are latching onto it because they feel that something made them extremely uncomfortable. And I think what made them uncomfortable was the destruction of that fiction.
And I raise the point of comedians because that's how a lot of young people they get the information about politics through comedy and through social media. Do you think it's a bad thing, Katy?
No, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think you have to get your information from a number of different sources. If you're only getting your information from comedians, that's an issue, certainly. But I think that comedians have more leeway to talk about things a little bit more freely than a journalist does, just by virtue of journalists having to maintain a certain level of impartiality. And I can't use the F word on television, number one. The White House Correspondents' Dinner, I mean, I've been so thankful to be here and not there for that. Because it's an uncomfortable party. On the one sense, it's always been uncomfortable, even with past presidents. But
why
particularly, I don't know. I don't know. I feel like if you really want to celebrate journalism, have a gathering of journalists and celebrate journalism. It does raise a lot of money for scholarships and for aspiring journalists. It intends to do good. But with this presidency, I mean, he's so openly antagonistic and nasty towards the press. He calls us the enemy of the people. I think it's highly uncomfortable to have an event where everyone puts aside their title and decides to be chummy with one another. And I think that's what she was exposing in a very blunt way. And I think that's why there was that reaction, but that doesn't make it less true.
Let me go to Wesley, and I'll bring you back to the final point of the question, which was if social media is dumbing us down, is that the fault of the social media or the fault of the people themselves who are using it?
It's an interesting question, but I think the way to think about it is more that it allows people to speak at all. I mean, I'm thinking about people who prior to Twitter were essentially voiceless. And I'm talking about as groups of people, not as individuals. But I mean, I'm thinking of something like, it's called Black Twitter, so I'm going to call it Black Twitter. But the way that there is now a sort of like an eventually organized group of Twitter users for whom there is a universe that is not reflected in most other aspects of mainstream media in the United States, who communicate with each other about delightfully strange things, powerfully important things. That is not a dumb conversation to me.
Not a zone of exclusion?
Excuse me?
It's not a zone of exclusion?
No, actually, it's a zone of inclusion. I mean, sometimes I think the reaction to some of the people with these accounts it's actually a place that, to the degree that Black Twitter is a place at all, it is one of often great joy and comedy and celebration of just the weirdness of being alive. And it is a break from a lot of other deeply painful things, but it is also capacious enough in its empathy and outrage to respond to any number of awful things that happen in a week. And, for 2 weeks now, for Black people in America, it's been, not any different than any other 2 weeks, but an interesting 2 weeks in terms of events that have happened. And Black people on Twitter, in particular, have been really interesting and moving around it. And so I don't know. I mean, obviously there are dumb conversations that happen on social media, but there are dumb conversations that happen next to me on the subway. I mean, I don't think that no one would ask me, is the New York subway system making us dumber?
It is.
It probably is, but nobody's asking me that.
Okay, Wesley, I'm going to have to cut you off there, but thanks for at least enabling us to end on a sort of uplifting note.
Sorry.
I don't think anyone here probably knows a lot about Black Twitter, but thank you for explaining it. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Alexis Okeowo, Richard McGregor, Masha Gessen, Katy and Wesley Morris. Now, you can continue this discussion with Q&A extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by the London Telegraph's Russia correspondent Alex Loon. Next Monday, Q&A will be in Melbourne with the Shadow Minister for Social Services, Linda Burney, the Liberal member for Goldstein, Tim Wilson, the founder of Get Up, Jeremy Hymans, social change advocate Laila Ajar-Alou, and former British Conservative MP turned author Stanley Johnson. And yes, he's the father of Boris Johnson. We won't have any reconstructions. Until next week, good night.
Nights in May, Stargazing Live returns.